welcome, welcome, welcome. We are so excited to have you here today. Thank you so much for joining us on this collaborative webinar. This is not just a GIA webinar, it's a collaborative webinar between grant makers in the arts and grant makers concerned for immigrants and refugees. And we're just so excited about this 2023 webinar, Narrative Change, Inspiring a Vision, and Protecting the Freedoms to Move and Stay. So I'm Sherilyn Seeley. I'm the Senior Program Manager for Grant Makers in the Arts. I will be one of the co-moderators for this incredible webinar. We've got some really great stuff coming your way. And I'm going to kick it over to my co-moderator to introduce himself.
Thank you, Sherilyn. And hi, everybody. It's nice to be here. My name is Cairo Mendes. I'm the Director of State and Local Programs here at GSER, Grant Makers Concerned with Immigrants and Refugees. We are a philanthropic mobilizing organization committed to moving resources and power. And we're comprised of 140 funder members from across the country of all types and sizes, committed to immigrant rights. And to your point, Sherilyn, this is a very important topic, very important issue, and we're glad to be collaborating together and pushing funders, right, to invest in narrative change work that advances pro-immigrant narratives, that honors the humanity of immigrants, and that will ultimately, right, shift the conditions culturally for people to see migration not as a burden, but as a human right. And before I send it back to you, I did want to make a quick plug for a narrative project, the Little Amal Project, which is Little Amal, which stands for Hope in Arabic, is a 12-foot puppet of a refugee Syrian child who has traveled to 13 countries. She began her journey from the Syrian border and carries a message of hope for displaced people everywhere, especially children who have been separated from their families. Amal's journey begins in Boston on September 7th and culminates in San Diego on November 5th. So over 9 weeks, Amal will be welcomed by 1,500 plus artists at more than 100 artistic events across 35 towns and cities. I am gonna drop a link. They are encouraging folks to attend, and feel free to check the link for you to learn more about this exciting narrative project. And so with that, I'll send it back to you, Sherilyn.
All right, thank you so much for that, Cairo. This topic is just so deep and dear to my heart. As a daughter of immigrant parents, I think about these things as an artist, as a family, as one who's a part of a family of artists. It's just, there's so many kind of intersections here that are deeply personal. And I'm just really excited that we're going to get into this conversation. So thank you for that, Cairo. And I'm really excited that we're working together. All right, let's go to the next slide. Okay, thank you. So in order for you all to have an optimal experience today with us on this 75-minute webinar, you can take a moment to review the Zoom features at the bottom of your screen. If you would like to use closed captioning, you can look to the bottom and look for that CC. That's the closed caption. You can turn it on. If you have any questions for our panelists, our speakers during the webinar, you can use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. I'm kind of going up up the image. Actually, I should be going down. I'm going upward, but I think it's okay. So look for that Q&A icon, and then of course you can use the chat if you'd like to chat to myself or Cairo or anyone who's in our space today. We'll have some time for interaction a little bit later, so those, you can use those features to have a really great experience with us. Okay, and if you have any questions, you can look for tech questions specifically. You can look for Jessica's name, Jessica LGC or Ali LGC, and they are in the chat, and they'll be happy to support you with any tech needs you may have throughout the webinar. All right, next slide. Thank you. Okay, cool. So as you know, this conversation is focused on kind of the intersection between narrative change, narrative strategy, and immigration, the intersections there. And as you probably read in the description, we were asking ourselves the question when we were in conversation planning this webinar, what would it look like where if people were able to easily exercise their freedom to move and stay, and what would that culture look like when we think about how immigrant communities are viewed and the narratives around immigrant communities and immigration itself. There are a lot of things that are misunderstood. And like Cairo was just mentioning, the goal is to not see immigration and immigrant communities as connected or associated with the idea of being a burden, because it's absolutely not that. And there's just so much beauty and so much art that exists and that you'll hear about shortly, in order to kind of lead us in that direction and the direction that we want to go with true narratives, positive narratives. And you know, we want you to be part of that conversation later on. So be coming up with your questions as our speakers are speaking, and later on we'll engage you a little bit further. So you can look forward to that. And so without further ado, because I realize I'm getting a little bit too excited here, I'm going to kick it over to our first presenter, Terry Marshall, founder and creative director of Intelligent Mischief and Black Migrant Futures Lab. And he'll be followed by Nayantara Sen, former lead designer for the Butterfly Lab for Immigrant Narrative Strategies and current director of field and funder learning at Pop Culture Collaborative. And lastly, we'll have Nick Szuberla, executive director and co-founder of Narrative Arts. Take it away, Terry. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sherilyn. Okay, check out things. Sorry, I'm always there's a lot of things on here. I'm gonna appear like an old man, always looking, so bear with me. Like, where's that button do? Thank you for having me. My name is Terry Marshall, the founder and executive creative director of Intelligent Mischief. Next slide, please. And yeah, I'm here. I'm not gonna take up too much of people's time, but I'm just gonna offer a little history of Intelligent Mischief and some examples of work we've done as a different type of narrative work, a different type of narrative strategy, using arts, culture, world building, immersive design, and aesthetics. Next slide. So a little bit of history of Intelligent Mischief. We founded in Boston in 2013. This is our 10th year of existence. All of us were former community organizers, had more than 20 years in the organizing game. But we always, I myself had always used arts and culture in the things that I did, including in traditional organizing. And I just came to a point where I realized I think there needs to be a space, almost like a lab space, where people could experiment more with these creative ideas, because many different institutions I felt were stunting creative activists from experimenting, and even when their results were greater than what they were traditionally doing. Next slide. And started our inquiry of like how do we catalyze counter hegemonies, what we call atmospheres of change, using narrative and cultural strategies to primarily free Black folk, but then also everyone else as well. And we talked about this, like how we reignite the political imagination of Black communities towards the future. Next slide. And so the basis of our work and our thinking, our methodology, our practice is Black radical imagination, world building, prefigurative structure building, and aesthetics. Next slide. And the way that plays out is in a couple of ways. We do art experiences and using pop culture. We have featured design labs, which is one, I'll give an example of one of those today that we did around, that was called a Black Migrant Futures Design Lab, and imagination world building. So those are immersive experiences, content we put out, such as podcasts, and other type of content, and also these salons and design labs that we put on, where we take on an issue and we create space to experiment using experiences and narrative. Next slide. So these are just a real overview of some examples. I'll go into some of them real quick. Next slide. So this example, what if blank was a Black utopia? This is a street art project that we've done, particularly in our own neighborhood in Bed-Stuy, New York, where as we know, real estate companies are useful. They use narrative in their strategies for gentrification, such as renaming neighborhoods and also putting up new signs along with the building structures. So this is where we get to play in physical space, and we put up these signs that we put up on lampposts, where we say the name of the neighborhood, as in, what if Bed-Stuy was a Black utopia? And these like public art signs become just a conversation in the neighborhood. Actually, we want to use it as a organizing force, which in our neighborhoods really has become like a huge conversation of people really referring to Bed-Stuy and discussing its history and future around the concept idea of Black utopia. We hope to spread this across the country in what we call establishing Black innovation, Black imagination districts. Next slide. Nationettes is a space where we get to play right now digitally. We also want to turn that into real life. It's a world, it's a immersive, imaginative world that we built. That's where not colony, sorry, forgive me. Former slaves who've been actually an advanced nation that's in the West that's actually trying to free people throughout the African diaspora. Next slide. We did an online 24-hour event because in this world where the Asians disguise themselves to get their message out through music, they disguise themselves as DJs. And we did a 24-hour party where it was interactive online play that people interacted with. And we hope to also bring this live in LA in the spring of next year. Next slide. The reach we had or where we put on 24-hour Nation slide event. Next slide. So rushing through that, and hopefully this part to talk about is what we started as the Black Migrant Futures Design Lab. We was aware of the attention of the Race 4 at the time was hosting a project called the Chrysalis Lab, and we applied to be part of it. We got in, and we had this idea for a while called the Black Migrant Futures Design Lab because we wanted to combat what we seen was a growing, small but growing negative movement known as ADOS, the American Descendants of Slavery, who build themselves as a movement for reparations, but really it's a disguised anti-immigrant movement trying to build anti-immigrant sentiment in the Black community and actually disorganize Black community and explicitly anti-Pan-African and anti-left politics, even though they disguise themselves with a lot of leftist rhetoric. And what we did was apply. We eventually came up with the project eventually became an immersive experience called the Archipelago, an immersive sonic experience. Next slide. And we went through was usually our process. We began with our world building process. So we gathered some comrades, we gathered some friends, people who are all like organizers, innovators, social entrepreneurs themselves from across the diaspora, people, Somali, African-American, Caribbean, Nigerian, and so on and so forth. And we had like about a month of a study of a research and study. We hired a person as a researcher, and we did research into immigration issues in the Black community in America, but also dig into Pan-Africanism itself. And we had the inquiry of understanding like, it's not just an issue around immigration. It's the issue of like what has happened to the rhetoric in the Pan-African movement, which really really brought together the issue of like Black liberation and immigration and cross and borderlessness, right? And we came to the conclusion that to combat the ADOS narrative, how could we like renew and reignite the imagination of a borderless Pan-African diaspora and the love that springs from, and what's our common history? But not only through a typical narrative campaign, how can we get people to have that feeling? And we did research on one of the last heights of the global Pan-African movement was Festac Festival in Nigeria in the mid to late 70s. And it was a Pan-African global cultural festival. And in our research, we found out that a lot of the different folks kept writing about the festival cultural stage. And a lot of people came together where different amazing thinkers and strategists and civil rights leaders and revolutionary leaders for different nations, Mary Baraka, Maya Angelou, so on, all just met together and would dance on this floor. And we really wanted, like, how can we recreate that feeling? And we just ultimately came up with the idea of a party. And some people was like afraid at first, like, this sounds silly, but we was like, no, there's actually a lot of room for like parties being spaces of liberation, parties being spaces of utopia, and immersive experiences. So we had wrote up a manifesto that people could see on the side. This would be the new manifesto, which is how can we get people to the feeling of borderlessness? And I know I'm saying that word wrong, but and we said music is one of the best ways to do this. Next slide. And so we came with the idea of Archipelago, and it'll show this clip real quick of what was the result of the work.
Archipelago. Archipelago.
Oh, okay, sorry. Next slide. And I'm sorry, I know if I'm behind on time, I'll try to wrap it up here, but just give people an idea of just some background. We did research. We came to the conclusion of during this experience. The first night was the party in the back, but it was over a 3-day experience. We did an immersive emerald African forest that people were coming through. We had hammocks. People took naps during the party. People took naps throughout the weekend. We had a Black women-owned bookstore pop up. We had an African marketplace. We had immersive projections on the wall. Is giving you to be inside this magical African forest, but at the same time, there's these messages of how to live in a borderless society. How can we be involved with one another? The party itself was a sound clash between Black DJs from Memphis, Tennessee, Jamaica, Brazil, London, Ghana, and Australia that we had live stream all at once, and it was battling each other. So we had, a lot of our stuff was like, how can we get people the feeling of being in a borderless society? How could we get people feeling and also have to understand the common connection, which was directly opposed to what ADOS was saying, that we're not connected, we're not one people, but people to feel and also have the narrative come through their body and in their eyes of that we are one, and that this society is actually more pleasurable. And our argument for this is always like in the funding space, we need to think about the immersive economy, immersive design. We need to think about the immersive economy right now is like $24 billion. There's people, Disneyland, escape rooms, pop-ups, events. We need this to also be a left space. We can have people experience and build prefigurative structures of the world we want. Next slide. And this is actually a picture of the hammocks, and those are really great. We need to get those back, and the sunlight coming through. Next slide. There's more pictures of like give you a whole day, like just where people could come in and just relax for the 3 days we're going on. Next slide. The hammocks were great. And this last picture, I just wanted to offer a story. We had it was a huge structure. We had, it was a big warehouse that we used. It was a 3-day experience. We hired folks most of the builders were either Black African American from Memphis or migrants. Some people undocumented who were primarily either Mexican or from Central America. And we, one of the leaders of the team, Miguel, who's one of the builders, we really made the effort to reach out and say, they was totally welcome to be invited to the event, the party. And Miguel took us up on it. And Miguel just came out like partying with us all night long. And one of our comrades was really making a connection with him and talked to him. And he said that Miguel was from Mexico, originally he's living in Memphis. And he said that he'd been in Memphis for 12 years. And this was the first time that anyone Black had kind of really, he felt like invited him in, and he was like, wow, he really enjoyed the experience, everything going on. And he just said, and when I think a comrade asked him, just how he felt about the place or why. And he said, no one's ever asked him, and we just want to use that as an example of also not just with building cross-border solidarity with African diaspora, but across all communities, and how was some ways we could do that. So that was just an interesting underlying story about in there. Could even be mindful of we definitely played them. Compensate them beyond even their price point, because we knew many people's undocumented. And all these things, and being very conscious of cross border, also cross community, cross racial solidarity as well. Keep in mind the work we was doing. And I'll stop there. Don't know if I went over that, but apologies if I went over time.
Right, it looks like I'm unmuted. Hi, everyone. And Terry, thank you so much. I feel like I should be also in a hammock in an emerald forest, living our collective best lives together. Thank you for that beautiful visual story. Folks, my name is Nayantara Sen. Namaskar and Dhanyabad. I'm a narrative and cultural strategist who currently works at the Pop Culture Collaborative as the Director of Field and Funder Learning, where I support practitioners and funders in learning about and applying narrative strategies in their work. And I'm also the lead designer of the Butterfly Lab for Immigrant Narrative Strategy, which was an arts integrated narrative lab housed at Race Forward from 2020 to 2023. And it focused on building immigrant narrative capacity, experimentation, and alignment. I should also note I'm a first-generation immigrant myself. I'm from a mixed status, mixed faith, mixed race family, and I'm also a working artist and writer. So the Butterfly Lab actually sunset in February of this year. But we left behind a fairly large body of open source work to catalyze and advance narrative and cultural strategies for our movement. And this work included things like a narrative system, pretty rigorous research findings, and concrete recommendations for both funders and practitioners who want to work with arts integrated narrative and cultural strategies. Our Butterfly Lab program, framework, tools, everything that we worked on was created for the immigrant narrative movement, but a lot of this work can be easily applied to other intersectional social justice issues as well. And I'll say more as we go along. I just quickly want to note that even though I'm here today solo speaking on behalf of the lab, this program was actually deeply co-created collaboratively by lab participants and cohort members and grantees, and my 5 other colleagues, Jeff Chang, Janelle Tribitz, Kana Hammond, Sara Abdullah, and Babay Tolentino, who are not here obviously physically with me today on the little screen, but are absolutely, their imprint is all over the work. So today, what I will do is share some top line lessons. I'm going to go back one slide here. Top line lessons with you from the Butterfly Lab program, some recommendations for grant makers and practitioners that came from the lab, as well as 2 pieces that I'm just going to drop them into the chat here. 2 pieces that were just published in the GIA Reader yesterday, so they're hot off the press. One of them is called How the Light Gets In, Narrative Power Building Through the Arts, that I wrote. And the second is Supporting Artists to Create Dangerously, The Immigrant Artist at Work, which was co-authored by Janelle Tribitz and me, and it's a reference to Edwidge Danticat's beautiful, beautiful book, Creating Dangerously. So please do find those links in the chat because I'll be referencing information from all 3 of these sources as we go along. So a little bit of backstory about the Butterfly Lab. Some of you might know about the program, but it is helpful to just sort of ground in it. We ran for 3 years during a very difficult period for immigrants and immigration broadly. The dominant toxic narrative around migrants, immigrants, and refugees was continuing to perpetuate really problematic ideas around the beliefs that we are exploitable, expendable, criminal, unworthy of equal treatment, and reduced primarily to our economic potential as workers and laborers. And this sort of dominant narrative environment has been authorizing policies that terrorize our communities, terrorize migrants, immigrants, and refugees emotionally, psychologically, physically, and economically. I am getting a notice that my internet is unstable, so hopefully I am not frozen, but I will continue. We also started, the Butterfly Lab started in the context of the Narrative Center having shifted hard right, especially with the resuscitation of the Great Replacement theory and narrative. And we began with research that showed us that the support for the pro-immigrant movement was far weaker than what we believed. Within the immigrant justice movement, we also realized that movement organizations, especially grassroots organizations, had some strategic communications capacity and staff and skill, but were underdeveloped and under-resourced in narrative strategy and capacity. And then a really significant contextual problem for us was that in the immigrant justice movement broadly, it had and still does have fairly uneven and sparse integration of artists and cultural workers in our movement strategies. So some of my cultural strategy colleagues in the field will sometimes call this approach an art in a box, quote unquote, approach, because it's limited, it's functionalist, it's sort of the approach where you find a BIPOC artist, insert them into a project or campaign and sort of expect them to pop open their magic box. And then there they are, they spit a poem or they drop a banner or they do a one-off public art activation. It's not really an integrated cultural strategy that embeds artists and culture workers into movement and narrative work from the very beginning and trusts them enough to co-create narrative strategy and projects with them. So this is the context in which we began against this backdrop, and we knew we needed to experiment with design that actually reached across disciplinary approaches and issue boundaries to some degree as well, to bring together a pretty diverse range of folks: artists, culture workers, cultural strategists, immigrant movement leaders, organizers, policy advocates, folks working in the legal space, and narrative experts. And we needed to bring them together to answer questions and develop movement strategy together. So the core question that grounded the entirety of the Butterfly Lab was this: how do we move audiences from the harmful status quo that we're living in to a pro-immigrant worldview? We began in 2020 by convening a set of 16 immigrant narrative leaders. You can actually see their names and faces here. I'll just briefly take a beat so you can register who they are. You'll see in the middle bottom, we also had Aisha Shillingford from Intelligent Mischief in the first round of the Butterfly Lab, and then they were also in the Chrysalis Lab in the second phase. And these leaders actually used Butterfly Lab narrative tools, which are now available in our open source narrative project design toolkit, which you can find on the website, on the Race Forward website. They used these narrative tools to prototype 13 narrative projects that were arts integrated projects. And we learned a lot from them about how we could build narrative capacity and align narrative strategy. A lot of those findings are in our phase 1 report, if you're interested. Across these 13 narrative projects, you can see some of the information on the screen here. We had a fairly incredible range of artistic and media activations and products. Lots of different kinds of artistic work, from hip hop and spoken word performances to food shows, to oral history collections, photography exhibits. We even had a sculptural installation that accompanied a direct action campaign. And most of these projects were arts integrated. We learned a tremendous amount from closely following all 13 of these projects and accompanying both the artists and the organizers who were creating narrative work. For instance, we learned about the need for additional rigor, strategy, and alignment in immigrant narrative work both for artists and for organizers. We learned about the need to anchor our short-term communications and policy work within longer-term narrative and culture change priorities. And you can actually read a little bit more about what we learned in our phase 1 report, because there's a lot of deep tissue applications and recommendations about arts integrated narrative strategies and project design as well. And advance to the next slide here. One of the key outcomes of the lab in phase 1 was this co-created narrative system. So you can see the visual. A narrative system in this particular iteration was a very, very simple and accessible framework that captured the synergistic relationships between a set of deep narratives in order to propose a cohesive pro-immigrant worldview that we should all strive for. So for the Butterfly Lab, which we called it for a narrative system for a future for all of us, consisted of 6 deep narratives: interdependence, abundance, belonging, safety, or the redefinition of safety, dignity, and the freedom to thrive. For those of you who are funding or practicing in the immigrant narrative space as well, you might recognize some of the DNA of this beautiful narrative system. Also references some work that came years prior from the Immigrant Movement Visioning Project. So this narrative system allowed us to talk about how to align our movement that is working on many different fronts, timelines, approaches, all at the same time. It also allowed us to center our work on building narrative capacity and enduring pro-immigrant majority through more intentional and aligned narrative strategy. So these 2 goals, what you see here, capacity and strategy, have been the through line for the lab since the beginning, and we were able to further operationalize this in phase 2. Phase 2 was just this past year. We had 4 primary programs. So we used the Butterfly Lab narrative system to support narrative capacity building for our movement. We built a community of practice with immigrant movement leaders and organizations, many of whom were striving to integrate artists and culture workers into their narrative work. We built actionable tools and released the Butterfly Lab Narrative Project Design Toolkit, which is the open source toolkit I mentioned, now can be used by artists and organizers alike to ideate narrative projects. We trained and coached and consulted with practitioners. I'm just going to pull up a slide here so you can see here some of the organizations we worked with: Center for Cultural Power, NILC, NDWA, and more. We also, as you heard a little bit from Terry about his project, we also supported 4 leading edge narrative projects at scale through the Chrysalis Lab. So you can see Terry's project Archipelago was part of that. We also had Muslim Futures Project, Little Syria, and the Tennessee Immigrant Rights Coalition. The other thing we did is we convened key immigrant narrative leaders around a table to create a much more aligned narrative strategy. And that table is ongoing. It's just getting off the ground now with the Opportunity Agenda. In collaboration with the Opportunity Agenda and Worthy Strategies, we also experimented with groundbreaking narrative research methodologies, conducted some broad national research, and generated findings that had direct applicability to ongoing arts integrated work for immigrant narrative strategies. So I actually just want to briefly, in the time that I have left, take you through 2 of the 5 core lessons that we surfaced through the Butterfly Lab over 3 years. Due to limited time, I'm going to focus on 2, but I do encourage you to read more about these findings in the report later. I will note that every single one of the high-level findings we had have applications for grant makers and practitioners who are working at the integration or the nexus of arts integrated narrative work. So we had discoveries on audiences, specificity of audiences, strategic storytelling, and building narrative power. But for now, I will just focus on sharing a little bit of a taste of the information we learned through fear of change and future storytelling. So as I go through these next 2 findings for you, I would love to just invite you to think about these application questions in mind. How might you imagine artists and culture workers supporting learning and application in this specific recommendation? If you are in a foundation or a grant-making organization, how might you apply this specific information to experiment with narrative grant making? And especially if you are a funder, are there current or prospective grantees that come to mind as you hear about this particular area of work? So one of the primary findings that came out of qualitative research and testing in the Butterfly Lab is that we found that fear is a core motivating barrier that addresses, that sort of hinders pro-immigrant support, and actually acknowledging and addressing the fear of change clears the path for overcoming fear-based opposition narratives. And so just to dig a little bit more deeply into that, there were 4 distinct types of fears. There were fears about scarcity, about change, about danger, and about chaos. And in some cases, we found that when we dug a bit into the fear of chaos and scarcity, undergirding that was really a deep-seated fear of change. And what do I mean by fear of change in the context of immigration? It's the fear that American culture will become unrecognizable, that we'll lose shared origins and values that make our nation what it is, that people will lose their power and privilege. It's, of course, an appeal rooted in white identity, but it's actually also resonating with people of color as well. And this is important because we learned that this fear was arising for people that we might traditionally consider to be in our base, who we already assume are with us. So what does this mean? This actually means that acknowledging the fear of change upfront in storytelling proved to be really effective in our testing for audiences that were both conservative and liberals alike. We didn't actually validate their fear in our work, but we did acknowledge their feelings and told stories of characters who overcame their fear of change and reframed change as a positive thing. So just as a quick example, we acknowledged that over the last 245 years, America had changed a lot. We showed a picture of an outhouse next to a bubble bath, a picture of a whites only sign next to MLK, and we said that change could be a positive thing for immigration too. The takeaway here is that we learned that our movement needs to lean into emotional, affective, and psychic strategies that really help audiences calm their fear of change. And artists and culture workers can do this very effectively through their narrative work. Short-term messaging strategies that tie too tightly to policy hooks may not actually cut through to this fear of change at a deeper level. Another finding that we came upon that is very related to the fear of change is about future storytelling. And I'd love for you to just think about what Terry shared as his project Archipelago is a really beautiful illustration of this. If fear of change is a core barrier to pro-immigrant narrative support, talking about a better, brighter future for immigration offers a powerful opening to build support. And in our lab, we actually tested many different stories about the future, all of them were based on the idea of a future where everyone has the freedom to move. So part of our research helped people imagine, like really, really imagine what their lives would look like and feel like if there were more porous and humanely organized borders that allowed them to move wherever they wanted and search for a better life for themselves. We gave an example of the EU for comparison, where people can travel across borders for better jobs or just to be with their families or generally choose a better place and reality for themselves. The importance of telling stories about the future that could cut through the fear really landed for us when we started testing our content against opposition narratives. So for instance, when we showed audiences an opposition narrative about the Great Replacement theory, we found that very little actually worked to increase their support for pro-immigrant work. But we actually did find that the only situation in which the content successfully inoculated audiences against the Great Replacement narrative is when stories began by taking audiences on a journey that first acknowledged their fear of change and then ended with a positive vision for the future. So this reinforced a lot of findings for us because it told us that cultural and futurist storytelling and immersive experiences that allow people to really feel what it would look like to live in a pro-immigrant future and actually acknowledge their fear and understand that it's possible to unlock that fear by leaning into an abundant vision, that really opened up a lot of ground. So what I'd love to do just quickly is offer a few more specific takeaways for grant makers who are interested in field resourcing. And you can find a lot of this information in the few links that I shared in the chat right before. One is just wanting to reiterate that we actually cannot cut through worries about scarcity, fear of change, danger, and chaos through strategic communications, message-based, campaign-level strategies alone. To reach audiences at the narrative level, we have to invest in the public imagination and prefigure an irresistible future. The next is that artists are actually narrative stewards and can be our most powerful allies when narratives are weaponized against us. They are well-equipped, they're well-skilled, they're well-positioned, but they're not well-resourced to build their narrative power yet. So to build narrative power, just quickly to give you boom, 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 a few recommendations. We need collaborative spaces. We need more labs, networks, cohorts that bring artists and organizers together to cross-pollinate and work on narrative systems. We know that labs work. We know that they can provide rigor, structure, and support, and really tactical supports like access to tools, access to expensive research, learning communities, coaching, technical assistance, and more. And then the last recommendation here is to really think about how to resource BIPOC and immigrant artists with tools and capacity while honoring their leadership and democratizing access. I will leave it at that. I know I'm a little over time. I want to pass it over to Nick, and we'll just drop the links back in the chat again so you can find more later. Thank you.
I'll just say yes, and so in 2010, a few artists were part of a fledgling effort to organize around the abusive cost of prison phone calls. And they went to visit Martha Wright at her home in Northeast DC. Wright had filed suit back in the 90s when she received bills that would amount to tens of thousands of dollars a year, simply for talking to her incarcerated grandson. The suit had been kicked around through federal courts and had landed at the Federal Communications Commission, where it was gathering dust. On the other side of the suit was a multi-million-dollar prison phone industry that was taking advantage of people, as well as the system of mass incarceration. The artist asked Wright if she would be willing to join the effort to address the issue through a legal, policy, cultural, and organizing means, and she said yes. One of the challenges that the Campaign for Prison Phone Justice faced was that on the other side, they were using a narrative of security, and that this was really powerful. It was racialized. And so the campaign, over a course of years, developed a narrative of belonging in response, a narrative of interdependence and inclusion. We are all in this together. And in the first several years of the campaign, arts and organizers advanced this narrative, this community narrative, through grassroots theater, story circles, June Book Theater, creating an online and offline story bank, passing out micro grants for folks on the front line to create stories in their own communities about the issue, in facilitating dialogues at tables, at conferences and other spaces such as Alternate Roots, Allied Media Conference, at community centers and churches, using a visual arts strategy. And all of this was around creating space for neighbors to listen to neighbors and realize they were not isolated in their experience or their issue. And, through that process, new strategies start to emerge. And the campaign, which is made up of, 30 or 40 groups, started to see seams in the other side's narrative and places to push. And as most of us know, the first step to building power for narrative change is like finding out that you're not alone in your grievance. And thousands of people in this case shared their stories, listened to other folks. The second step, and it was found in the act of creating art in all of these ways in a democratized way, was winning a small victory. So you're building on that victory, and organizers will tell us after you win the small victory, you keep on going up the ladder. And so, the Martha Wright, after a decade, we ended up having the Martha Wright Reed Just and Reasonable Communication Act, which was signed into law early this year by President Biden after over a 12-year struggle, ending hundreds of millions of dollars flowing from incarcerated people's families each year, and advancing a narrative shift in the field. And, this victory, it can be claimed by many groups, national and grassroots, and certainly artists played a very active role from the very beginning. Community narrative building is fermenting everywhere. And we could draw all sorts of diagrams tracing how it advances. I think three things from this particular example that foundations and philanthropy can find, or kind of model from is that it takes funding over a period of years. And one reality is that foundations probably don't most often have the length view to fund a decade of work. And so you have to one of the things foundations have to do is they have to organize and build philanthropic power and relationships so that there's not just one funder supporting it. The other thing is, and we heard in the examples before, is that this power of networking. And one of the most powerful moments for me in that campaign was when a national funder who would not put money on the table for the campaign offered to convene their grantees, their DC-based policy folks, and the grassroots and the artists showed up, and we made our pitch. And at first they were very resistant, but as they kind of heard about the work, they became much more open to it. And third, I think providing small micro grants, right? That's just a very key strategy towards advancing stories, and it's supporting narratives. Narratives are made by many people traveling a path. Many of those folks are taking risks and telling their story. The work is about democratizing our public spaces of discourse in the arts, culture, journalism space as a key step to narrative change. My name's Nick Szuberla, by the way. I primarily work in Kentucky, Tennessee, North Carolina as a working artist for narrative arts. And we're, really focused on storytelling and the power of storytelling. I'll share in the chat just a guide that we've done that I think is very useful to this conversation for the philanthropic sector. And so, we were doing this work around the Campaign for Prison Phone Justice, and we began a conversation with the Convergence Partnership about 5 years ago. And they were exploring as a funder collaborative how to do narrative strategies. And their work is around transforming policies, practices, and systems to advance racial justice and health equity. And they do it, through amplifying community power, racial and health justice, equity and philanthropy, and narrative transformation. And so we're really invested in all of those strategies. So the opportunity as artists to collaborate with the funding network was really attractive. And some of the work we did to get started with them were narrative scans, like looking, what are the narratives and stories your grantees are using? What are you using? Your funder collaborative, how does that pan out? We did story capacity that you heard, building story banks. We started to work on culture strategies. We produced a strategy for doing podcasts as a form of final report. We have a guide there. I'll share the guide with you in the chat. And then we kind of came on to, through all this, that there are a lot of different narratives. There are a lot of folks doing narrative practitioner work, and we wanted to understand it better. And so we engaged with Rinku Sen and Mick Moore, two narrative strategists, to ask them to explore the philanthropic sector and how funding narrative was occurring, in the kind of current state. And the result was a report, the Funding Narrative Change and Assessment and Framework. And so I'm just going to talk about the report a little bit, share some of the findings, which I think are quite relevant. I can't cover all of it, but we wanted to know, like, what are the different approaches to narrative change funders are using? Is one approach dominant? Who are the practitioners hired? Are they artists? Are they professional comms people? Are they community organizers? Do they share a philosophy in how to train, audit, strategize, in other words, engage? And how cohesive is the field as a whole? And so the report kind of delves into that. What I'll share really quickly is, we found that there was a widespread commitment to narrative power among funders, that narrative change, and community narrative building is prevalent in most sectors. But there's a lot of different approaches, and there's a little bit of a top-down versus bottom-down approach. So we'll delve into that just really briefly. And some funders do both of those strategies. I will share, let me share the link for you to download the guide while we're talking about it here. I think, it not really surprising, but that there is many foundations are using a top-down strategy where they bring in professional storytellers, as the example that was brought in earlier, mentioned earlier about bringing in like one artist to kind of drop a tool. With the bottom down, we see direct giving to grassroots partners, supporting impacted communities, having the narrative surfaced from those kind of challenges and solutions at the front line. I think that, of course, there is a considerable overlap between narrative and culture change. Artists were supported at least in part as storytellers, and storytelling was a central to shifting narrative. And I think if you want to think about, as a funder, where have you supported a pop culture strategy? And that just seemed to be over and over a dominant aspect of using different types of pop culture strategies. So I think in our Q&A, we could delve into hearing from you all how pop culture strategies have worked in your funding. Just really quickly, we put forward a framework in the report for funders. And it kind of creates three areas: mass media, mass culture, mass movement building. And we think of looking at what you are funding or what you're thinking of funding in those three areas as part of building narrative change efforts. It's a good way to audit your work. In the mass media, we have journalism, nonfiction, analysis, mass culture, really the pop culture strategies that we heard about earlier, and mass movements, storytelling, arts, and culture. That includes the folk and traditional arts as a way of really building strong community efforts. I think when we talk about mass media, it feels far away from many of our communities. I can say as a Southern based rural artist that, thinking about journalism, but there's, so many new strategies emerging that are really excited in local journalism efforts. That there are ways of pushing our stories and our narrative shift efforts into mass culture. And I think we heard some examples of how to do that from the Butterfly Project. And I'll just kind of move forward here. Kind of finally, and this is, it seems to, it all percolates up from supporting mass movement. So in the example I gave earlier, the Campaign for Prison Phone Justice, which ended up, being referenced on Netflix and having op-eds in the New York Times and the Washington Post. And, suddenly that issue is emerging in pop culture efforts. It would not have happened if mass movements had not been supported and pushed those stories forward. I really encourage you, if you have time, to download the report. It's extremely rich. Part of the goal is we think that there's too many silos in the field, and that this is a way to help engage across sectors how narrative strategy work is happening in the broader field. Finally, I go back to a few artists across the country and community organizations laid the foundation for a larger narrative change effort. People mobilized to fight when they could see that their story was part of a larger effort, and that they weren't alone. And artists and cultural projects helped build mass movements, support culture shift, and and push into our mass media. Is really how we make the road for narrative change. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Nick. And thank you to you, Terry, and you, Nayantara. I feel like I'm just sitting with all the brilliance that you all have shared, and I've been in a few webinars with you all, and I feel like every time I'm learning something new. Nick, I really appreciate this point around building philanthropic power. I think that's something that, as a former community organizer now in the philanthropic space organizing, is how do we continuously build power and get funders to see, right, that immigration is so connected and it's so cross-cutting with so many issues, right? I'm sure many of you are sitting here and probably have, your minds percolating, and so we're gonna just transition to this slide. We're gonna share the Jamboard on the chat momentarily, if we haven't already, but we just want to kind of sit back and just kind of share everything that's coming up for you. Feel free to post what is resonating, what's coming up for you, what are some questions that you have to the speakers that folks might want to be answered during the Q&A portion. What are you curious about? And we'll do that for a few minutes, and then we'll come back and we'll do a short Q&A and wrap up the program. I see some really exciting posts here. One is this piece around community narrative power building, growing the narrative power in the hands of local communities, Black utopias inside of gentrified spaces, right? I'm sure there's a lot more coming. Feel free to keep posting. And then there's also this question here, right, around youth artists and youth artists missing. I'm actually going to transition us to the Q&A portion because I know we're a little bit short on time. And I just want to encourage folks to use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen to ask any questions you might have of this panel of speakers. There's this one question right from the Jamboard. Youth artists are missing. How are our youngest artists and emerging artists being primed and invested into powerfully participate in the greater narrative field? So that's a question to you all. I don't know who would be the best person to start, but passing on the mic to you, Nick, and Nayantara and Perry.
I'm happy to start. I know we're short on time, and then Terry, maybe if you want to chime in, and Nick, maybe you have some thoughts too. I'm really grateful for this question, and I'm hoping and thinking maybe it comes from the folks from Youth Speaks who are in attendance. For those of you that don't know about the work of Youth Speaks, specifically their growing and long-term narrative change and narrative strategy work with youth organizing and youth power building, please look them up, youthspeaks.org. I just quickly wanted to say, in the context of this particular session at the nexus of arts and cultural strategy and immigrant rights work, in movement building for immigrant narrative, the work of youth organizing and youth narrative strategy has been so tremendous in this space. So I'm thinking of just the 10, maybe 15 years of work that it took United We Dream to organize really sort of marginal groups of young undocumented people with a really careful cultural strategy plan and process for building pride, for building shared understanding of undocumented identity and pride in being a first-generation immigrant or 1.5 second-generation immigrant, being undocumented. I'm speaking on from personal experience, being a young undocumented person in the past as well, and how important that was for me to come into this country and years later find places like UWD and UndocuBlack, UndocuQueer, narrative spaces to actually orient to and feel pride in. And just wanting to note that type of narrative and cultural strategy, it didn't happen in a year or two. It happened over a decade, and it was very clearly connected to grassroots youth-based organizing, grounded in the realities of young people's lives. And if I can, just for time, make a quick jump here. The work of United We Dream and the DACA movement, the UndocuBlack, UndocuQueer movement has completely defined and transformed the way that we think of narrative organizing, cultural strategy, and actual narrative power building work in immigration for the foreseeable future. I mean, it made me into the immigrant narrative strategist that I am. It transformed how we think about actually building strategy and building institutions that are grounded in youth power. And so just wanted to give credit where that's due, and also to note that that is actually still an anomaly, that there's an enormous gap still in answering that exact specific question. Young artists and young immigrants, particularly migrants and refugees, are not invested in as narrative leaders as they should be.
Yeah, nothing else to add after that.
That's great. Awesome. Nayantara, yeah, I couldn't, as someone who was a young person coming out of the shadows 12 years ago, and sharing my story for the first time, right? There's a lot of resonance there to what you're sharing, and deeply grateful for these spaces, and how do we continue to grow and invest in them, right, for future generations of young people. We have 5 minutes left. I'm not sure if there's anyone who has a question. Feel free to, drop it on the chat or Q&A, so we can, I often call them a Zoom waterfall. So if there's anything that's coming up for folks, feel free to drop. And if not, I'm also happy to send it back to you, Sherilyn, to close us out.
All right. Well, right before we close out, I do have a burning question. And I'm curious because, so Nayantara, you talked about the 5 learnings that came out of the butterfly and one of them was, and you spoke about it in your presentation, one of them was around change and the fear of change. And I think that in addition to, what came out of the results of the butterfly lab, just in the world, like it's a constant conversation. People are talking about, oh, I wish we could go back to the way things used to be. Even on like an individual level, like if there's a process that someone's working on, excuse me, and then they have to suddenly shift because the system's changing or whatever the reason, like a lot of people are very averse to change and to movement and to having to like shift their behaviors and be open. So I'm just wondering if of those 5 findings, if that was like kind of like the biggest one, or if there were other ones that came up a little bit more, just things, because everyone who's on the call and who will watch this afterward, just in terms of like where should we focus our efforts, I'm wondering kind of what you've seen. And Terry and Nick, if you want to kind of chime in as well, in terms of like the big thing that's like kind of making people shy away from supporting narrative change work.
I'll just answer very briefly, and then I'm hoping, Nick, maybe you can chime in a little bit on the framework that comes from the Convergence Partnership, just in the context of how philanthropy can think about this as well. My shorthand answer, Sherilyn, so it wasn't so much that the fear of change was the biggest revelation and learning, and it's in the context of narrative strategy and cultural strategy work is fundamentally about equipping people and supporting them through change processes, whether they're embodied, psychological, behavioral, motivational, attitudinal, and societal. So it's all about change, and people are naturally scared of change, but also it is true that people change all the time, and people are supported in many ways to change. And so part of what we do in narrative strategy work as movement strategists is figure out, well, what makes it possible for people to change? And so the other 4 findings are actually they intertwine. One of the key ones was audiences change for different reasons, and different types of stories help different people change differently. So having specificity on what's the change you want to go towards, actually being grounded in the clear vision of the future, prefiguring that, as Terry was talking about in his project, really making that reality for the future possible, real, imaginable, palpable, irresistible. Those are things that were more actionable, I would say, in that regard, because the fear of change is just, it's probably been true ever since humans were alive, but that is also the sort of texture of our work. And I did write a little bit more about this in the piece that I just published on the GIA Reader yesterday, How the Light Gets In, so you can find more in there. But I wondered, there's the Convergence Partnership report is really instructive, because part of what the subtext of this question is, for me, if you're a funder or a funder collaborative, even, where do you begin? Where do you focus? There's so many things to do in narrative work, where to begin. And the framework that it really, sort of supports people in figuring out, like, what's the level of change that you're trying to create? Where can you intervene? So I don't know, Nick, if you might just chime in a bit on that too.
I mean,
I recognize Nick. I recognize we're 15 minutes after. If folks have to drop off, we are recording this. But if anyone can stay around a little bit longer, go ahead, Nick. We'd love to hear from you and Terry.
I think the one thing to acknowledge in the fear, which resonates so strongly with me, is the other side has made a long-term investment, a 30, 40-year investment in advancing that fear. Mm-hmm. And so we, I'll say kind of generally, have not, and that we have not made the investment in narrative strategies that is comparable to what has been fermented. And so they have worked many of the same storytelling strategies, many of the same kind of policy pushes and framings. I think on the, the narrative change side, maybe the big takeaway is that we need to really trust grassroots, and we need to invest deeply in grassroots. And it is not just a value of, oh, I believe in grassroots. It is the most strategic investment we can make in advancing narrative. And I think one of the things that we heard from the Butterfly project was that it's about like carrying the freight, and that like if we don't if we don't have the buy-in from the grassroots and that community and that face-to-face interaction and that type of community engagement that was talked about, once the funding goes away, the narrative push will go away. If we're really doing this grassroots investment, it goes for the long haul. And so I think that's just really the quick and short answer. That this is really about finding the will to do long haul strategy. And for foundations, I think there's an internal conversation about where do you want to land, like what are we trying to do if we ladder up our values all the way to the top? Like what are we pushing on?
Yeah, that's great. Thanks for that, Nick. And I appreciate you noting that there's so much push and pull in like both directions, and there needs to be more in the direction that we're talking about, towards justice, towards liberation. And so I appreciate you kind of acknowledging that like there's been a lot of push in one way, so like we gotta level up in the opposite direction. Terry, did you want to chime in, or are you feeling good? Feeling good? Yeah. Okay. Cairo,
Yeah,
any?
okay.
Oh, okay, perfect.
No,
Cairo,
good.
sorry, go ahead. I'm like talking. Okay. Cairo, anything before I wrap us up?
No, I was just kind of curious, we're heading into 2024. There's a lot of narratives out there already. Just sort of curious what are you all seeing? How are you, addressing it or working to address it? How are you collaborating with groups on the ground? Because we know things are, we've been seeing what's happening at the local state level, right, with Florida and other states. And so I'm just sort of, out of curiosity, what are you all seeing and how are you working towards changing it?
I'll just say the Pop Culture Collaborative inspired us in North Carolina for the first time after doing decades of very serious documentary. We have been working with a few people to do comedy and humor, and to create work with folks who know how to do this. And it's very hard as a serious documentary filmmaker. And so it takes a little bit of risk taking for many of us who've been in this space for a long time to embrace pop culture strategies. So hearing and seeing examples about joy and fun, we need more of that.
I'll just say, I'll say real quick, want to leave on a good note, but also cautionary note. One of our findings we found out around ADOS's message was that it was wide, but it was not deep. That a lot of our the research that Nayantara and folks at Chris's lab helped us do, Harmony Labs, was find out that our counter message was like, people largely in the Black community still agreed, like, we see each other as one, we connect, all those things. Was counter against ADOS. It's just that ADOS is like loud, very loud, and they put themselves out there, but their narrative was saying it's not as deep. But at the same time, when the day after we did our event, we had noticed that Tariq Nasheed, who is somebody that's like prominent in that world, he's actually split between him and other ADOS people. He's creating a Foundation of Black Americans, blah, blah, blah. People could look it up. That he actually appeared, Puff Daddy, P. Diddy, had Revolt TV, his TV network had put on a conference in Atlanta, a Revolt conference. And they had a panel on reparations, and Tariq Nasheed was representative on there. And so I was like, I remember thinking it was the day after our event, and thinking like, dang, we did this with like how, like, just in terms of pop culture, who gets seen in that way. And so I think we have to invest and just put out more content actually on this front in order to get further our message.
And I'll just briefly say, sorry, I have a bit of Wi-Fi instability, so I hope it doesn't kick me off again. So the Pop Culture Collaborative is an arts and narrative funder. So if you're curious about what kinds of grantees we're working with and supporting who are doing deeper work on the ground across a range of different issues. I just dropped a link in the chat to the Becoming America Fund. There's a lot in there, but just very broadly about narratives that we're working to dismantle across a range of different issues. The collaborative's work has been and will continue to focus on work around gender justice, immigrant rights and justice. We are starting to do work on what is sort of loosely being called the True History Narrative Network around really interrupting attacks on and erasure of BIPOC history, true history, the suppression of historical narratives that come from historically marginalized communities, and that really cuts across all of the fights that are happening in public education now. One of our areas of intervention is realizing that there's more and more book bans coming, there's more policies restricting, and more white nationalist organizing in parents' rights groups. And so a lot of children and parents are finding access to true history in pop culture spaces and films and in books and things like that. So that's one area. And then obviously organizing a lot more around the narrative movement on white nationalism, among other things. But I'd encourage you to look on our website too, because it's kind of sprawling, a lot of different areas.
All righty, well, fantastic. I typically would say, is there one final thought, but I don't think we have time for that at this point. But I really appreciate all of you and your presentations today. For those of you who are here, this has been recorded. We will be sending out a recording. If you have any more questions for our presenters, their emails are on the screen, and we'll also be sending out a PDF of the slide deck, so you'll have that as well. We are going to be dropping a survey into the chat, so you can let us know what you thought about our collaborative webinar. And outside of that, if you have any questions, you can reach out to me, Charlotte Seeley, or Cairo Mendez, and we will answer whatever you need. And we're so glad that you joined us today. Thank you so much and have a great day. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you all.